Well, we've been going through a study on the life of Joseph. You see there in the front of your bulletin, if you're new with us, it's called Joseph, a series of unfortunate events. And I think this is week 5, if I'm correct. We've just been breaking down that story of Joseph. And if this is your first time, you may want to go back and listen to some of the previous messages to see how we've gotten to where we're at today. I'm going to finish the study on Joseph today. Okay? And Joseph, if you haven't been here, go back and read the story in the end of Genesis. His life started out bad. We talked about the bad beginning. It started out bad, and it seems like it continued to get worse. But last week, we saw how all of that good, or all that bad, finally turned around to good, and he was put in charge of the whole land of Egypt. God had given Joseph the wisdom to interpret a couple of dreams for Pharaoh. He predicted 7 years of bumper crops, followed by 7 years of famine. He advised Pharaoh to store up the excess grain during the good years, so that they would have food during the famine. Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the grain collection process, and for 7 years, Joseph collected grain and put it in storage. And we ended last week with Genesis chapter 41, verses 53 or 53 through 54, which says, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. And then if we jump down to verse 56, it says, when the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Joseph now has a position of power. He doesn't just have power in Egypt. He essentially has power over the whole world, because the whole known world at that time was experiencing the famine. We just read about that. The whole world came. It wasn't literally the whole world, because population had not spread across the whole world yet at that time, but the whole known world. The famine was everywhere. The only food was in Egypt, and Joseph is in charge of the entire world's food supply. He decides who eats and who doesn't. If Joseph decides to deny food to someone, they don't eat. There are a lot of people that have mistreated Joseph over the years. This would be a perfect opportunity to pay them back for what they've done to him. He can say, Potiphar's wife accused me of a crime that I didn't commit, and I spent years in prison for that. I don't think she deserves to eat. He could say, no food for her. If he decides they don't eat, and nobody would question it because he's in charge. I'm going to try to go through 6 chapters today. And just to read those 6 chapters that take longer than the time we have together, it would take us probably until the evening service. Well, maybe not quite that long. So I'm going to have to give you the Reader's Digest version or the condensed version this morning. So you're just going to have to bear with me, and you may want to read it because there is so much good stuff in here. I really wanted to read it. In fact, I thought about breaking it down into several weeks so we could get through it because there's so much good stuff in the story. It's an amazing story. But what I want to focus on is what I believe God wants us to learn from this story. Okay, so we're going to focus on that part, and I'm just going to read a couple of the scriptures to you. If you have your Bibles, you want to try to follow along. We're starting in chapter 42. Starting 42 verse 1, it says, when Jacob, that's Joseph's father, when Jacob learned there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? Apparently these boys are standing around. We don't have anything to eat. What are we going to do? Our garden won't grow. They're just looking at each other. He says, why are you looking at each other? Why don't you do something? He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die. The 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. Now, jump down to verse 6 with me. The first part of verse 6 says, now they're going to Egypt to buy food. Now, Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold to all its people. So here you have Joseph's 10 brothers. Go back to the beginning of the story. His brothers hated Joseph. His brothers mistreated Joseph. And now Joseph's the one that gets to decide if they live or die. It would be a perfect chance for him to get even, pay them back for all their deeds against him. These brothers had thrown him into a pit. with an intent of letting him die. And if you remember, they sat at the top of the pit. After they threw him down in the pit, they sat at the top of the pit eating lunch while he's down in the pit starving to death. And they laughed at him. It's been over 20 years since they've seen Joseph. They have no idea what's happened to him, and they really haven't given it any thought. They just know they sold him. The last they knew, they saw him going off with a caravan, and they're pretty convinced that by this time he's probably dead. The last thing they expected was that Joseph would be making the decisions on whether or not they can buy grain. Joseph essentially had the power of life or death over the men that had never done anything kind to him their entire lives. In fact, we read, it said they could not say one nice thing to him. Not one. They couldn't say anything nice to him. They hated him so much. If anyone had a right to get even, it was Joseph. It's a perfect opportunity for him to do a little payback. Now let's pick up the story in verse 6. At the second part of verse 6. It says, when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. Now, why would they not recognize him? Verse 8 through 9 says, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Why would they not recognize him? First off, it's been 20 years. He was still a teenager when he sold into slavery. He's obviously changed over that time. He's now dressed like an Egyptian in Egyptian clothes, probably has one of those Egyptian fake hair things, wig. He's speaking like an Egyptian. They didn't know who he was, but he knew who they were. What would you do? Oh, then it says, then he remembered his dreams about them. Remember those dreams that Joseph had when he was a child about his brothers bowing down to him? All of a sudden, he remembered the dreams. He says, here his brothers are bowing to him, and he remembers the dreams. What would you do if you were in Joseph's position? These brothers had laughed at him when he told them about his dreams. They said, we'll never bow to you, and yet here they are bowing. Something they said they would never do. I know what I would have done. Joseph's a bigger man than I am, because I probably would have immediately revealed my identity to them. I would have said, don't you know who I am? I'm your brother Joseph. Remember those dreams I had that you laughed at? Who has the last laugh now? You said you'd never bow to me, and here you are doing something you said you'd never do. I'll bet you're sorry now about the way you treated me. Remember when I was in the pit starving and you guys were eating lunch? Now you're hungry. You expect me to feed you? I'll laugh like you laughed when I was starving. Think again, bros. How many of you would have the same response I had if your wicked brothers that treated you poorly came? I would have said, no way, guys. This is payback time. Joseph has not seen his brothers in over 20 years. Since he became ruler, I doubt he's even thought about them much. He has a new life and a new family. I wonder when the last time was he really thought about his dreams that he had as a child. The hatred that his brothers had for him, in the years he spent in bondage, his rise to power, those things were maybe coming back occasionally, but he had probably completely forgotten about the dreams. But now he sees his brothers immediately. He remembers those dreams. Joseph now knows that everything that has happened was orchestrated by God. It all makes sense. I think this is the first time that he realizes, this is why I'm here. This is why this has happened. Now, last week, he got promoted to power. He's probably said, okay, God's finally recognized that I was mistreated. God's finally rewarding me for being faithful to him. But I think it's at this point in Joseph's life when Joseph finally says, all that was God. God's not just repaying me for being faithful. God was actually doing all those things. God was actually allowing those things to happen. God knew that my family was going to be starving, and God put me here. God allowed my brothers to mistreat me. God allowed me to be lied about by my master's wife. God allowed all these things because God needed me here. This was all part of God's plan. Now Joseph knows why he's there. But he decides he's going to have a little fun at his brother's expense. He accuses them of being spies, and he has them thrown in prison for 3 days. Now, exactly why he does that, we're not told in the scriptures. There are many theories. Some think he was testing them to see if they had changed over the years, and he does do that later on. He does actually test them to see if they've changed. Others think that it's his way of giving them a little taste of what he had gone through. I spent some time in prison. I want you guys to experience some time in prison. But it doesn't say exactly why he did it. Of course, they don't know who he is yet. It would make more sense for him to throw them in prison if they knew who he was, said, I'm Joseph, your brother. Here, let me give you a taste of what I went through. But they don't even know that yet. Why exactly did he do this? But they did come to the conclusion that they were being punished. They remembered, even though Joseph hadn't brought it to their attention, they don't know yet who he is. On their own, they came up with the conclusion God was punishing them for the way they had treated their brother. In verses 21 and 22, they said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress came upon us. Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They believe Joseph is dead, and this is God's way of punishing them because they had something to do. Even though they didn't follow through and actually let him starve to death, they didn't kill him. They were convinced that by now he is dead, and God is getting back to them because they are at fault because of the way they had treated him, because of selling him. It's their fault, and God's getting back at them. I'm not sure if this is God or if it's just Joseph having a little fun at his brother's expense. But God is allowing it, and the brothers are forced to think about what they've done. For years, they've been trying to sweep their sin under the carpet and forget about it. Now it's staring them in the face. There's a lesson in here for us. Sin has consequences. We can sin, and we can think we have it hidden. They've hidden it from their father Jacob. Their father Jacob just thinks that he was attacked by a wild animal and killed by an animal. Their families don't know what's happened. The only ones that know are the 10 brothers and God. See, we can't hide things from God. Cain thought he could hide it from God when he killed his brother Abel. But God saw it. Cain had to suffer the consequences of that. In some small way, God is having them experience a little bit of pain because God saw it. Our sin will catch up to us. We can't hide it from God. Although there is a good ending to this story, and the brothers are never severely punished, they didn't get what they really deserved. But their sins against Joseph and the agony they're going through right now is punishment enough in their minds. Joseph still pretends to believe they're spies. So he releases them from prison, but he holds Simeon. I'm going to keep Simeon here to verify that you're not spies. You said you have a younger brother at home that didn't come with you, so I'm holding Simeon here. The rest you can return home, but when you come back, you need to bring your younger brother Benjamin to prove that you're not spies. That'll verify your story. If you bring Benjamin back, Simeon can go free. Otherwise, he's going to stay in prison and eventually become my slave. So he gives the other boys full sacks of grain, sends them back home to their families, but in each sack of grain, he puts the money that they had brought to pay for the grain. Again, there's debate on why he gave each of them their money back. I think it's because Joseph didn't want to take money from his family. This is my family. God has put me here to provide for them. This is my purpose in life. I will not charge my family for grain. Now, why do I believe that? Because if you look at the rest of the story, never once did Joseph charge his family for grain. He charged everybody else, but he never charged his family. Their family. He's already forgiven them for all the evil they've done to him. He knows that he's there for this purpose. The Egyptians, if we read in chapter 47, we read that the Egyptians, when they ran out of money, they were buying grain, and they couldn't get more money because that was how they got their money, was by growing grain. They couldn't grow grain. They couldn't sell grain. Instead, they're buying grain. It says when the Egyptians ran out of money, they came and they said, we're out of money, but we need grain. Joseph said, fine, give me your livestock, and I'll give you grain. So the Egyptians gave all their livestock to Joseph. Actually belonged to Pharaoh because Joseph was working for Pharaoh. Then all their livestock was gone. They came back and said, we have no money and you have all our livestock. We're hungry. Can we get something to eat? Joseph said, sign your property over to me. So they signed their houses and their property over to him. By the end of the famine, the Egyptians owned absolutely nothing. They had given it all to Pharaoh to buy grain. And then what did Joseph do? He leased the land back to them. He said, tell you what, the crops will grow again now. Here, let me give you some seed. You can plant this seed. But remember, the land's not really yours. You can plant the seed, but 20% of every crop comes back to Pharaoh because you're working his land. They had nothing. But at the end of the famine, if we read the end of the story, Joseph's family had some of the nicest land in all of Egypt. They had the land of Goshen. It was given to them free of charge by Joseph and Pharaoh. They were given houses to live in. They never had to pay a dime for the grain. They never had to give their livestock, which they had lots of. Joseph never required anything for them. His family got stuff from the land of Egypt. Everyone else lost. Now you may say, that's unfair. Sounds like some politicians I know. They're just going to take care of their own families, and who cares about the rest of the nation? But there is scriptural basis for taking care of your families. We need to take care of our families. We shouldn't try to profit off of our own families. See, some kids see mom and dad just as their personal banker. Your mom and dad are not your personal banker. Now, mom and dad will help you when you really have a need. But it's not your mom and dad's responsibility to pay for all the luxuries that you want in life. And some kids, once mom and dad are out of money and can't give them anything anymore, they just put them away somewhere and forget about them because mom and dad are no longer useful to me. Now, it can go the other way, too. Parents, our responsibility is to also help our kids. We shouldn't be trying to profit off of our children either. We take care of our families. If we can't take care of our family, the Bible says a man that won't take care of his family is worse than a what? Is worse than an infidel, or worse than an unbeliever. We do need to provide for our families. So Joseph sends them back with the money. Let's get back to the story. The grain that Joseph's brothers took back to their families in Canaan eventually ran out. They're forced to come back to purchase more grain. They're terrified to face the governor again. Notice they still don't know who it is. It's just that governor. They're terrified to face him again. They do bring Benjamin because Joseph told them they would not be allowed in his presence. Said, you will not be allowed to see me unless Benjamin is with you. They also brought back all the money that we returned the first time, additional money to purchase new grain, and gifts from their father. Their father said, take all these things, take these as gifts, beg his forgiveness, because they're convinced that it was a mistake that the money was given back to them. When they arrive in Egypt, Joseph invites them all to have dinner with him. He still doesn't reveal his identity. And they're amazed when he has them seated according to age, oldest to youngest. They think, how could this man know what positions? Oh, well, it must be coincidence. Or, well, maybe he's a prophet or a seer or something. The next day, Joseph has their bags filled once again. He fills them with grain, and once again, he returns all of the silver from the first time and the silver from this trip, puts it all back in the bags. But this time, he has his own personal cup placed in Benjamin's bag. They start the journey back home. Joseph sends his men to confront them. All the bags are searched, and Joseph's cup is found in Benjamin's bag. Benjamin is accused of stealing the cup, and the punishment for his crime is decreed. Benjamin will stay in Egypt and become a slave to Joseph because he stole from Joseph. This time, we're told it was a test. Joseph wants to see if his brothers will only think of themselves and return to Egypt without Benjamin. That's what they would have done years ago. They would have said, well, at least we're safe. We're kind of, sorry about Benjamin, but, at least we're free. And they would have just gone back home and told their father some story about the evil governor in Egypt, or Benjamin got eaten by hyenas or something on the way there. Or do they have hyenas in that part of the country? But Joseph wants to see, have they changed? He knows that if they return to Benjamin, or to Jacob, without Benjamin, his father will be crushed. And he wants to see what they're going to do. All of the brothers return to Egypt with Benjamin, and they go to see Joseph. Judah offers to become Joseph's slave in exchange for Benjamin going free. He says, don't keep Benjamin. Our father will be crushed. He's already said he can't live. He's already lost our brother Joseph. And if he loses Benjamin too, it'll be the end. Please don't do this. Let me stay. Let Benjamin go. I'm bigger anyway. I have more to offer. Let Benjamin go free. I will take his place. 20 years earlier, none of them would have been willing to do that. Each boy was fighting for position. All of them wanted to be on top. None would ever volunteer to be a servant or sacrifice themselves for the well-being of another. His brothers have passed the test. They've shown compassion. They've shown concern for one another. So Joseph has all his attendants leave the room so he can talk to his brothers alone. So far, he's always talked through an interpreter. That's another reason they didn't know who he was. Even though he could understand what they're saying, he spoke through an interpreter. His brothers believe he's an Egyptian. But when they're alone in the room, Joseph speaks to them in Hebrew. He says in chapter 45, verse 3, then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. What do you think is going through his brothers' minds right now? They just realize who this man is. And they remember everything they've done to him. I am Joseph. And he asks the question, is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They know that Joseph remembers what they've done. They know that Joseph has the ability to do anything he wants to do to them to get even. And they know that whatever he does, they deserve. But Joseph doesn't want to get even. He just wants to be a family again. Chapter 45, starting at verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. These brothers they were the ones that threw him in the pit. They were the ones that sold him to the Egyptians. But Joseph says, it wasn't really you. You were the instruments that God used, but this was God's plan. My watch is talking to me. Talking back to me is more like it. Joseph says, you were instruments used by God, but it was God's plan. None of this would have happened if God didn't allow it. God caused this. Remember Jesus on the cross? Looking down at the men that had beat him, put the nails in his hands and his feet. And Jesus could have said, God, sick them. Pay them back for what they did to me. But Jesus looked down from the cross. He said, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Interpretation, they don't know that they're simply doing what you have set them up to do, because without them doing that, I couldn't do this, and without me doing this, the world could not be saved. Jesus said it's not really their fault. The devil made them do it, literally, but God allowed the devil to make them do it because it was part of God's plan. They were tools being used by God for a higher purpose, and that's what Joseph realizes. Yes, my brothers did the physical act, but it was God that caused it all, God that allowed it all, because God needed me here to take care of my family. Joseph then sends his brothers back to Canaan, And he has them move his father, their entire families, and all of their livestock to Egypt. And they're instructed not to worry about any of their household belongings. He says, just leave all your ratty furniture there. Because when you get here, I'm going to give you brand new furniture. I'm going to give you the finest furniture we have in the land. Leave all your household stuff there because it won't even compare to what you're going to be given when you get here in Egypt. So not only does he not take their money, he gives them stuff. His family moves to Egypt. They're given land, houses, and furnishings. And Joseph continues to feed them throughout the famine, never charges them a dime. He realizes that this is God's plan. This was God's purpose for him. Now let's fast forward to chapter 50. The famine's now been over for years, but Joseph's family still continues to live close to Joseph in Egypt. Many years later, their father Jacob dies, and his brothers are once again afraid. They're convinced that the only reason Joseph has been nice to them this long is because of their father. Now that father's gone, now Joseph is going to bring the punishment because they're still punishing themselves. They're still, they still know they're guilty. They're still beating themselves up, and they know now Joseph, or they believe now Joseph is going to actually come back and pay them back for those evil things. So we get to verse 15 of chapter 50. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you were to say to Joseph. Now, I wonder if Jacob actually said this or if they're just trying to convince Joseph. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I asked you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. In his heart, he had already forgiven them. And yet his brothers are still walking around thinking he's got a grudge against them. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. They'd rather become his slaves than have him execute them or something. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. They did. In their hearts, they knew what they were doing. They intended to harm him. But God intended it for good, so that he could accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. I have been providing. I will continue to provide. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Notice verse 20. You intended to harm me. They knew exactly what they were doing. You know what? Throughout life, we have people that mistreat us. We have people like Joseph's brothers who can't speak kindly to us. Everything they say is mean. They slander us. They tell lies about us. They mistreat us. They steal from us whenever they can. People will not treat you right. That's part of life. The question is, how are you treating other people? Hopefully you're not treating people that way. But in life, as long as you're here on this earth, people will mistreat you. They mistreated Joseph. They mistreated Jesus. They mistreated all of the apostles, all of the prophets. Look in the Bible. People are people. People are not nice. But Joseph says, even though you knew what you were doing, even though you intended, because some people do it on purpose, some people do it out of ignorance, they just really don't know what they're doing. They say something to us that offends us, and they really didn't intend to offend us. It just came out that way. We misinterpreted it. But some people actually did it on purpose. Joseph says, you knew what you were doing. It wasn't right, but you know what? You couldn't have done that unless God allowed you to do it. Because God could have stepped in at any time. God could have stopped that. God allowed it. So I'm not mad at you. God allowed it, and God allowed it because he had a greater purpose in mind. Which brings us back to where we started this series. Our theme for the whole series has been Romans 8:28. And we know that all things, everybody say all things. All things God works for the good. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The key in that is to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. If you are honoring God, if you are loving God, then God will cause all things to eventually turn in for good. Now, if you're not following God, if you're not honoring God, I can't guarantee you that everything's eventually going to turn out good. So it comes back to our heart. Where is our heart? Are we honoring God? But let me tell you, when you try to get even, when you try to get revenge, that's not honoring God. God says, vengeance is mine. We are to love. We are to forgive. We let God fight our battles for us. Nothing can happen, even if somebody's doing it deliberately and knows what they're doing. They cannot do it without God's permission. They cannot do it without God allowing it. And if God allows it, God has good things in store. He will turn it around for good if we allow him to finish his plan. When someone mistreats us, the natural thing to do is to try to get even. We want to settle the score. We want to teach them a lesson. But if we try to get even, we will cheat ourselves out of a blessing. Even though we may not understand why all these bad things are happening and why somebody's treating us the way they're treating us, God is working behind the scenes. He sees everything, and he has a plan. It might not happen tomorrow. It might not happen the next day. For Joseph, it took 13 years. Well, he was mistreated before that by his brothers calling him names and stuff, but from the time he was actually sold into slavery until the time he was released and became the governor, it took 13 years. Most of us don't want to wait 13 years. But are we willing to let God accomplish his purpose in us? God is at work, even when we don't see it. When we're going through tough times, instead of getting angry, instead of holding grudges, instead of getting even, we need to have the attitude that Joseph had. Joseph says, you didn't do it. I mean, you did, but it wasn't you. It was God. God did this to me. And God did it because he had a purpose. He knows exactly where I am, and he's working. He's working all things out for me. And maybe he's preparing me to be a blessing to others. Possibly, God's even going to allow me to be a blessing to those who are right now mistreating me, because that's the way God operates. God calls us to love. He calls us to forgive. He calls us to endure. Whatever situation I find myself in, I will rejoice. I won't get angry. I won't get upset. I won't try to get even. I will say, God, I don't understand this, but I know you're in control because I love you with my whole heart. And God, I don't understand it. Someday I will. But God, I know you are working this bad thing out for my good and possibly even the good of others. James said, count it all joy when you go through trials of every kind. Thank you, God, for this trial. I don't really like it, but I know, God, that you've got good that's going to come out of it. And God, I believe that the worse it gets, the better it's going to be. So God, bring it on. As Clint Eastwood would say, make my day. Give me some bad so that I can have more good. God, I trust you. What are you doing? Let's all bow our heads and close our eyes. I don't know what some of you may be going through in your lives. I don't know what kinds of things are being said about you, how people are treating you. You might be being cheated. Maybe you're being slandered. Maybe somebody's stealing from you. Your boss may not be doing things right. Maybe you've got a physical attack on your body. There's something going on physically right now. Maybe the enemy is just battering you with all kinds of stuff. Maybe it's emotional or you're having spiritual attacks or something. I don't know what's going on in your life. But I do know that if you keep your faith in God, if you keep honoring God, God will take whatever's going on in your life right now and he will turn it around. He will make something good out of it. Because God takes all things and works them for the good of those that love him. So don't give up. Don't get angry. Don't get even. Just keep your trust in God. Say, God, I don't understand it right now, but I know that nothing happens without you knowing about it. And what I'm going through, you know about it. And you're working it out for me. Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us to take the story of Joseph. A series of unfortunate events. And if not for no other reason, let us just remember all the things he went through, because whatever we're facing is probably minor compared to the things that Joseph went through. We don't like it. We think it's pretty big, but when we look at Joseph's life, we can actually say, okay, I'm thankful I'm not Joseph. Or we can go back and look at Job in the Old Testament and say, at least I'm not Job. But even if we are experiencing something to that degree, help us to learn from Job and to learn from Joseph. You're allowing it to happen. Those people that are doing things to us, they don't realize that they're just tools of you. You're using them to bring this turmoil into our lives because you want to strengthen us. You want to make us better. You have a good plan for us. So let us endure whatever we may be going through right now. We'll keep praying. We're going to say, God, please, as soon as possible, let me learn whatever lesson I need to learn and bring me the strength that I need. God, I want this to go, but in the meantime, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to allow you to do what you're doing. And I know that in the future, maybe a couple months, it might be a couple years, it might even be a decade. But I know that my life will be better in the end because you have promised to take all this bad and turn it into good. Thank you, God, for being in control. Thank you for loving me and having great plans for my life. I trust you even through the tough times. Amen.